Welcome to a relational deep dive. Types of relationships that can be used in your story. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's many. So I'm going to list them out, bin them, and then we're going to talk about at the end, applying it to a particular story case, and we're going to write a story together.
So this is going to be a more expansive look at what types of relationships we can be using. Broadly speaking, there are really three kinds of relationships that we can use in our stories. There are things in your world that your character doesn't care about. And this is actually excellent many times because you can use this as an opportunity to seed future obstacles. But when I do that, I need to be clear that I'm going to eventually make a connection. So the wrong way to do ambivalent relationships is to say, okay, so I introduced this random character and I gave him a cool backstory and a solid intro and I make you really interested in him and you never see him again. You failed to use ambivalence. When Gandalf first hears about the ring, after Bilbo gets the ring, he's a little bit ambivalent to it. But what happens at the beginning of Lord of the Rings? He finds out, oh no, this thing that I didn't deal with is now a real threat. That's the right way to do ambivalence. Your cooperative relationships tend to be the relationships that are most closely contributing to your character's goals. Your character's goals are developed because they love something or someone. And that desire is developed based on cooperative types of relationships. Romantic relationships are one type of cooperative relationship or potentially cooperative relationship.
As you wish.
There's a reason that Helen of Troy is pursued. The longing and the desire for her beauty is what kicks off 10,000 ships. Samwise Gamgee, as an example, it's a love of Frodo that makes him go, but it's a love of the Shire that makes him persevere because he wants to get home. But that adventure is only given its force and its value because they have a home to return to.
Do you remember the Shire, Mr. Frodo?
If that home is completely destroyed, they would end in despair. That at the end of the Lord of the Rings, which, spoiler alert, but it's been out for a lot of decades, so get over it. At the end of Lord of the Rings, they arrive back in the Shire and find it overrun by wicked men who are being led by Saruman, who was let go. And the last battle that the hobbits have to fight is in their home to remove all of the corruption that occurred from Saruman invading the Shire. We go further back, this principle of a loving and a longing for home is the basis of the Odyssey. There is a battle to be fought at home. I'm going to just pull aside for a second. That particular longing is a very deep-seated human longing that ties to the biblical narrative of the Garden of Eden. There is a sense in all of us, and the Bible talks about this, that God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. And we have a sense of the loss of the beauty of the Garden of Eden. That longing is absolutely part of the human experience. This is about the reality of human fall, that we went from paradise in the garden to being exiled from paradise. And the whole of human history is the attempt to return to paradise. That longing for home resonates a lot with people today. If you haven't really thought about using the longing for home as part of your desire and your goal for your character, try it out. You won't regret it. David and Jonathan have this excellent friendship, and that friendship leads them to do all sorts of incredible things. Like, they are warriors for the Lord in Scripture. We see their desires in alignment, even though they are on completely different ends of the succession for the throne. And there's this beautiful image that we get when Jonathan actually gives his armor to David. And this is crazy because it's a picture of Christ and his beloved, right? David's name literally means beloved, and Jonathan means the Lord gives or gives gifts, right? Like, we have Jonathan, who is, according to human mandate, the rightful heir to the throne, who recognizes that God has dictated that David is going to be the next king, that Jonathan doesn't get to come into his princely role. And instead, he takes off his royal armor and his royal robes and he gives them to David. Like, incredible. Incredible. This friendship that crosses boundaries that would otherwise put them at conflict. That is a beautiful story. Third type of relationship is conflict. Conflict. This is where stories thrive.
Challenge incites conflict.
Because conflict creates tension, and a good storyteller builds and releases tension so that you experience the story. Because remember, I said in the previous video, and if you haven't watched it, I'll link it up here. The previous video talks about how your audience is part of your story. So since your audience is part of your story, you need to make sure that you are allowing them to feel the tensions and releases of the story as if they were engaged in the activities of the story. So that when your character goes through conflict, they can embody that. They can mirror it. They can mimic it. This is how we get all of our desires.
Aw, he copied me.
So if you're doing a good job as a writer, your audience is going to draw desires from your characters. And then they're going to try to embody those desires. This is also why, another slight tangent here, this is also why it's so important as Christians that we are telling stories that feed the right desires. Because it's very easy to accidentally or intentionally, if we're malevolent, but accidentally feed desires that are contrary to God in storytelling.
Get to the point.
Conflict creates tension, and that tension you want your audience to feel. This is how you pull the story along and you pull your reader along. This is how we create an emotional movement throughout the course of the story. That pacing, that relationship between tension and release is something you need to be very cognizant of in your story. That comes down to a little bit of style, a little bit of grace, and the effects you're trying to produce. But conflict is what builds those tensions. So what types of conflict can we build? Well, there are two broad types of conflict. One is external, the other is internal. So I'll actually talk about internal last because I think it's the most interesting. But the external conflicts are broken into kind of three categories. You have dumb obstacles. No malevolent intention, it has no agency. It's a wall that has to be climbed. It's a door that has to be picked. It's a mountain that has to be scaled. It just is. And by virtue of its existence, it can be in the way. The second type of external obstacle that we can face is an opposing agent.
Opposing agents can be personal or professional. And an opposing agent that is personal is somebody who hates you or your character. This is somebody who has it out for you. Ultimately, an opposing agent who has a personal vendetta against you knows you intimately and has some sort of desire that is opposed directly to you. The professional opposing agent is somebody who just wants something that is opposed to what you want. They may not even know that you exist, but what they want and what you want are opposed. Sauron wants the ring to rule the world. Frodo and the Fellowship want to destroy the ring. Well, Sauron can't wield it and Frodo destroy it. And Sauron doesn't even know that Frodo really exists when we first start out. He doesn't need to. The opposition between their goals has very little to do with whether or not they know each other. So when you have a professional opposing agent, they don't need to know you to be in your way.
The other external conflict, which then will lead us into the internal conflicts, is opposing ideas and ideologies. And this can express itself in terms of law, which is actually also an expression of opposing agents. But opposing ideas are often more incipient. There may not be a law against a certain activity, but if in your society, for instance, certain words and ideas are there, muggle, and this is a racial slur for somebody who is not a pure blood. So we have a racial tension here. This is an opposing idea. There are agents involved because ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the minds of agents. But the idea itself has a kind of life of its own because it may express itself across many agents and across the whole of society.
I'm reading a book called The Will of the Many right now, and I'll do a review on it at some point. But the idea of the will of the many is that you can cede your will to others in order for them to be more powerful. So the magic system itself, having to pull strength or draw strength from others, requires that there be some sort of hierarchical system. And there is a hierarchy in the book. And it makes perfect sense that there would be, because the system, the way that magic works in the world, requires a hierarchy for power to be consolidated. That's really well done in this book. But when you're thinking about opposing ideas and opposing systems, think about the magic that you have put in place.
It may express itself in institutions, not even just laws, but in institutions. And it's up to you how you want to build something like that into your world if you think it's useful to the overarching story and theme. But what I'm getting at is that there are cultural aspects to the world of ideas that express themselves in the processes, institutions, and systems of that world, and vice versa. And that leads me into the internal struggles. So internal struggles for characters are often the most deep and profound ways to connect with your audience. As humans, we have a fundamental makeup. We have affections, the things we love, intellect, the things we think and believe, and will or volition, the things we do and choose. These are the three parts of who we are as people. And when we understand this, it actually starts to get really, really easy. This framework, it gets really easy to start thinking about types of internal conflict that we can explore. Our affections, our intellect, and our will are rarely perfectly aligned. We believe things that aren't true, we love things that aren't beautiful, and we do things that aren't good. And often we're just out of alignment with ourselves. There are people who have very strong intellects and very weak desire. Maybe you've met them, they're like, oh man, I have no ambition, but they're like wicked smart. But because they have weak desires and their minds are overwrought, they essentially create these labyrinths in their mind before they ever make a decision. You can also have people who are super affectionate. They love everything and they're super passionate and they have no intellect. It goes straight from the passions to the hands. They do whatever, they have no filter. So they do all sorts of sporadic, random acts. And their conflict is, why can't I control myself? Then there are the people who, they don't necessarily have strong desires. They don't have a strong, intellect or grasp of why they do what they do. They're just doing. They're essentially just going through the motions. And that could be a languishing kind of going through the motions. Well, I just exist and nothing really matters and I don't really want anything, but I feel hungry, so I eat. Or it could just be a straight, like, I just keep myself busy to be distracted because they don't really know what they want. And it's scary to think about what they want. They go to two versions of laziness, right? Either they do absolutely nothing or they do as many things as they possibly can to distract themselves from the lack of real desire and real care and real belief.
You can have conflict within one of the spheres. So in the sphere of the affection, you can have warring desires, where I want competing things. This is the Paul analogy in Romans 7, where he says, that which I do not want to do, I do, and that which I want to do, I do not do. This tension of desires. You can have a tension of ideas where you're not sure which ideas are correct. You know what you want, but you don't know how to get there. The method to get there is a conflict in your mind. And then finally, you can have tensions at the level of will because we're not all powerful. And because we're not all powerful and we're bound in time and space, as long as you're telling a story with a character who is in fact finite, there will always be competition in the will for what they can and cannot do in a particular time and place.
So those are just a few examples of how you can use this framework of the affections, the intellect, and the will to think about what are the types of internal conflict that we can have. All right, so essentially here is what we talked about over the course of this video, tools that you can use. Now we're going to use some of the tools to build the skeleton of a story. Let's say we start with a character, and let's just use the overthinker as an example, as the archetype that we're going to use here. He's got weak desires, but he's whip smart. Well, how do we get him off the couch? Well, he has a friend. Now the friend we're going to say is the compulsive. Very strong desires, but maybe not the smartest. The friend wants romance. He has a girl that he likes. So our character draws his desire from the friend. He doesn't actually care that much about the girl. He's ambivalent to the girl. But his friend wants the girl and he has the intellect to help, so he's going to try to help. So that's the goal, right? Our character's goal is to help the friend get the girl, and the friend's goal is to get the girl. But relationships change over the course of a story, and this is where it gets interesting. Ambivalence shifts to romance for our character. He falls for the girl. This is your typical love triangle. But let's add the opposing idea, obviously from the society, that one woman for one man. Now, what that does is it turns our character's friend into an opposing agent. Now, a professional opposing agent, because their goals are at odds. They don't necessarily hate each other yet. But what about your audience? Your audience is going to ask at least these two questions. Why should I care, and what's at stake? So why should your audience care? This sounds like your typical love triangle. Like, it's not really all that interesting. So what is it about the girl or about the characters that could make it more interesting? Well, what if the girl is actually supposed to be a sacrifice for the festal harvest? And if she's not sacrificed, then a curse will destroy their land. Now, this is a different kind of story, but we still have a similar kind of thing on the front end. We just had to add a little bit in from our world. So now what do we end up with? For our character, we have warring desires because he wants the girl, he wants to help his friend, and he doesn't want his society to go up in flames from the curse. But the warring method could be, not to be crass, but if the sacrifice requires a virgin and she's not a virgin, then that's one way to save her. But is that the right way to save her? Especially if you actually love her, like our character does? You see how we started creating additional layers to the relationships, just starting from these simple building blocks. Maybe try it out. Finish this story. We've created a bunch of problems and a bunch of questions that your audience is going to want the answers to. Now, if you like this video, go ahead and check out this one or this one.